Hi, Liz Whiteacre here. Let's talk about how we invite readers into our stories, whether they are real or imagined. This week, we are taking close looks at the short stories and personal essays that we've written the past 2 weeks and providing constructive feedback in workshop. I'd like you to pay close attention to style as you're reading other people's pieces and as you're reflecting on your own work as well. Today, we're going to think about how are we welcoming people into the things that we've created so that we are setting up expectations, anticipations, and understandings of what's to come. When you're thinking about inviting readers into a story that you've written, whether it's fiction or creative nonfiction, the first impression that we have is our title. I know titles are hard, and often we will submit things to workshop where it will just say short story or title or a question mark or I need help. So we're going to think about ways we can title pieces that might help us not only as we're preparing to share our work with others, but also as readers, we can think about how titles are influencing us and how we engage with the piece as we go. We're also going to focus on the first paragraph, which can establish the point of view. What kind of narrative style are we going to be experiencing in our story? It can establish the voice. Who is this person telling me the story? What do they sound like? Are they sassy? Are they sad? Are they intelligent? Are they confused? All different types of subtle clues you can give your readers in the first couple of paragraphs so that they kind of have a sense of who the narrator of the piece is. You can let people know what the place is. What is the setting? Establishing who the people are that live in this story. Consider what the action is that might be starting as the catalyst for the particular story. And you can also establish mood. How should I be feeling as the story is getting started when I'm reading it? Titles set a lot. I don't know, I'm thinking they're really important oftentimes. When we're starting to write, they're overlooked a little bit. I feel in the process, oftentimes we don't start with the title, we kind of start with the idea for a story and then think, oh, well, what are we going to call this thing? So when you're thinking about titling your pieces, you want to consider what do you want readers to anticipate before they start. They might be seeing this title in a table of contents. They might be seeing this title in an email or a post to the forum. They're certainly going to be seeing the title as they first open up your document and start the page. So titles can do a lot of different things. They can establish character. Right? Who is this going to be about? The title could let you know what the place is. The title can suggest what the plot is, what is going to be happening. So we know before we even start reading what the story might be about. And then of course, you can mess around with that. It might not be what we think at the very beginning. It might suggest what the culture is of the particular world we're about to explore. Sometimes writers will use their title to establish a symbolic object. We can also get a sense of what the theme is. What's the life lesson or moral that we're going to be learning from this particular story? And sometimes titles serve as metaphors that we'll see later developed in the stories that we read. I appreciate the text is small on this, but I wanted to provide a bunch of different titles that are doing different things, using different strategies. These are all retellings of Cinderella, and I'd like to go through them pretty quickly. Please grab a pencil or a pen, your writing utensil, and a scratch paper. I'll give you a moment to do that. And I'd like you to make note of the ones that you find most compelling. If you were just kind of walking a library shelf or a bookstore shelf and you were seeing these titles, which one might you pull off the shelf? So that first grouping, we're focusing on character, right? The rough-faced girl, soot face, Cinderella, ninja warrior. So Maureen McGowan is letting us know right? That her Cinderella is going to be a little bit different than the groom's Cinderella in that title. So we're focusing on the girl, just like the original Tellers of Cinderella did. They let us know this is the central character. In the next grouping, we get a little bit more of a sense of place and time. Smoky Mountain Rose. It gives us the idea of a setting. This is an Appalachian retelling of the story. We might also consider Smoky Mountain Rose, whether or not that could be connected to character, if that's something that the main character is called in the story, or it might be a metaphor connecting the rose that's growing in the mountain with the character. So I'm a little unsure there. That one intrigues me. Before Midnight, we're focusing on a deadline, a time before midnight. So we're thinking about, well, what's going to happen in this story? Maybe the most important things are going to be leading up to that particular deadline. If we look at the next grouping, we're focusing on objects. We have throne of glass, 5 glass slippers, and the golden sandal. So in these moments, we're kind of looking at an important element that will, we hope, appear later in the story. And then that next grouping I thought was interesting. So we have a description, fair, brown, and trembling, an Irish Cinderella story. So when I'm looking at that title in comparison with the original Cinderella, I'm thinking that it might be Cinderella being described there as fair, brown, and trembling, but I'm not entirely sure. Ever After, the film, is picking up that famous ending of fairy tales, happily ever after, but we're not being given the happily. So we know Ever After. I'm really curious about the ending of that film, or if the film might be picking up after what I know about Cinderella and focusing on kind of the epilogue, if you will. Cinderella is dead, quite bold. I'm curious about what's happening there. We're taking a character and we're saying she's dead, so that's where our story is starting. The stepsister scheme. So I'm going to assume that here the focus is on the stepsisters in this retelling and not necessarily on Cinderella, and that the stepsisters are perhaps more intentional, right? They've got a scheme going on, which might be a little bit different than just generally not being a very good sister. Being kind of mean in the original tale, we don't know how intentional they were being. Bound, I thought was interesting. We just have a verb there. I'm curious about what is bound. And then charm, Tales from the Kingdoms. And so charm was interesting to me as well. We have a verb there, very different than bound, the connotations that that brings up. So these writers were starting with the Cinderella tale, and they were beginning right with that premise, and then they went in different directions. And given the number of retellings, if you go into Amazon Books and take a look, a lot of stories that are retelling Cinderella are called Cinderella. So these writers wanted to change the expectations. They definitely in their descriptions have Cinderella associated with them. So we know that there's a connection there, but they're pulling focus and changing our expectations in different ways depending on what they've chosen to title their pieces. So let's test out some titles. Keep that writing utensil handy. This is a haiku I wrote on the fly. So it's a rough draft and I am not sure what to title this. Sorry, I thought it would be easier to see this than a whole short story. So we're going with a small nugget here, but I think that this will illustrate our point. What I'd like you to do after I read my poem to you is write down 1 or 2 titles. What could I call this thing? So the poem is Chapter Ends on Sun. Set down book until Monday. Snuggle with Sweetie. So take a moment. Let me know a couple of titles you think could work for this particular poem. Have you got a few? All right. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I did some investigating myself. I kind of thought about a bunch of different options, did some brainstorming. And so these are 6 titles that I came up with. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how they changed the poem, the relationship between the two of them. And I can't wait to find out what you have titled the poem so that I can find the best choice. So in the very first one, I could choose the form of the poem to title it. So this is a haiku. And if I start haiku, chapter ends on sun, set down book until Monday, snuggle with sweetie. I'm announcing what you're about to get. I'm going to want to make sure that I've got my 575. I followed the rules so that you don't end the poem and say, what? That's not a haiku. So if you are going to title something short story, right? You want to make sure it's a short story. So the expectations that set is for the form. What am I delivering you in this poem? If I look at the one directly next to it, I could title this poem Before She Leaves for College. And that changes who sweetie might be. Right? Could that be an affectionate term for she? I don't necessarily know what the relationship is. You're looking at the poet right now and you're thinking, okay, that is the speaker. I do have a daughter, perhaps that's the daughter in this poem. If you are kind of bringing in your own personal life into this, it might be a beloved. It could be somebody who you know really well. It could be a roommate. So the expectation of what snuggle with sweetie means is something that is different than if we look over at COVID-19. Chapter ends on sun, set down book until Monday, snuggle with sweetie, right? If I kind of, I know it's hard to get out of your head, but if I don't put the context of someone leaving for college before I have finished my work at sunset, I'm not going to return to that book until Monday. I'm thinking it's the weekend and I'm going to spend that time snuggling with my sweetie. If we're thinking about that within the context of a pandemic, right, then we might not be focusing so much on who sweetie is, but we're thinking about perhaps work-life balance there, or we might be looking at, well, chapter ends on sun, set down book till Monday. Is that a metaphor for what's happening with a particular illness? Let's go down to the bottom line, fluffy ginger cat. Chapter ends on sun, set down book until Monday, snuggle with sweetie. Now if I'm putting a cat, a fluffy orange cat in your head, then you might be thinking the sweetie is the cat, not a woman or a girl, right? If I move to the next title, TGIF, right? Thank goodness it's Friday. Then I'm putting the focus in the poem on the fact that I'm setting down my work, and that might become the focus there. How I'm feeling about being able to have a break and snuggling with my sweetie. And then if I choose to title my poem something like Broken Ankle, right? Oh my goodness. Then that snuggling might not be celebratory, like we got time off, it's the weekend. It might be looking for comfort. I can't do anything. I've broken my ankle, and so we just have to rest. So depending on what you choose to title your poem or your story or your personal essay, it's going to get an idea in your reader's head that will affect how they interpret the rest of the piece. Once they have the title in their heads, then we're looking at how we are welcoming our readers in with that very first paragraph. No pressure, but you are establishing a lot in the choices that you're making. In that first paragraph, You are establishing your narration, and that goes back to those choices of, for example, point of view. Is this an omniscient narrator that knows everything about everybody? Is this a limited omniscient narrator? Maybe I'm following around inside one person's head. Is this subjective? Am I not getting any internal thoughts and feelings? And also, point of view in terms of the pronouns being used. Is this first person, third person, second person? Also, that voice, what kind of language choices are being used? Is this someone who comes from a particular place or time, culture? Is this someone who is comfortable with the language that they're speaking? Is it very casual? Or is it someone who is using maybe elevated language, trying to sound a particular way, and it might not be working so well? How much attention is given to the narrator? Is it the voice of the person speaking, so it's first person and you're in uh, Taylor's head and you're getting all the snarky thoughts and all of the wishes and dreams and this is happening? Or is it far away? Is it someone kind of looking down on Taylor and telling you what Taylor is doing with their day? The place can also be established. It may or may not be, but you can kind of get a sense of the environment, where the person is moving around in. Sometimes we're not even introduced to the character at the very beginning because the writer wants to give us a solid sense of where we're at in the world and in time. People, we might be introduced to characters. It might be the main character, it might be a secondary character. Action, right? What's happening in this very first piece? And what does it feel like? Is it really exciting? Maybe we're starting in medias res in the middle of things, and all of a sudden, whoa, we're driving really fast down the road. And as a reader, we're not sure what's going on. Maybe the character driving is a little unsure of what's going on, or maybe that person has a lot of purpose. They need to get there. And we're along for the ride, and we're going to find out why a little bit later. So I have put in 3 different shots here. One is a really long shot. Sometimes as writers, we want to give people the lay of the land. And in that, remember what we called exposition, that little bit of backstory before we get started with a catalyst or something that's going to get our personal essay or our story going. That might be something that is used in that first paragraph, a bigger frame or a wider perspective. We're seeing it from far away before we go in. Or we might be zooming in a little bit. I have that picture of the coffee shop there. If we're in a space that is very familiar, comfortable, immediate to the characters or the narrator and the personal essay, there might be some assumptions made. We might not be given quite as much detail there, but we know enough about it. We can fill it in. Or there might be a lot of detail. Maybe the place is going to be really significant in the story. So we want a scene to be set so that we know exactly what things look like. And then I have our shadowy people backlit by the sun, again, to suggest mood, right? How you're describing people, you don't have to provide a lot of detail. If you notice in this picture, you can't see what people's faces look like. You just kind of a general, it's even a little hard to tell maybe what the genders are, but we do get a sense of, right, what's happening from the dark shadows. I like to imagine that this is early in the day. It kind of looks like the sun coming up. And so maybe people are getting started. Whereas you might say, oh, well, no, that's a light coming from car headlights. This is in the end of the day. It's very dark and very sinister. So you can establish the mood with the way you are choosing to describe things to your readers. So while you are in workshop this week, it is important to think about how were you welcomed. When you read your partner's stories, when you read your partner's essays, I encourage you to take in the title and stop, and in your track changes, make a comment. Right? When you see that title, what do you think is about to happen? What is put in your head? What are your expectations? And then pause. And then read, right? Read that first 1 or 2 paragraphs and stop. and put in some comments. Let the writer know maybe what you think could happen or any questions you have about what you have been introduced to already. You might say, well, how are you feeling about things right now? Do you have questions about what's going on? And then finish the piece. And of course, comment on your experience as you go. But at the very end of the story or essay, go back to those notes that you originally took at the start of the piece and provide an additional comment. So don't delete what you put there first, and reflect on what happened, right? Were your expectations met? Did they throw you off? Do you feel like there are any details that would be helpful for you to know, or maybe you would like to see them take them away, right? Well, if you didn't let me know this, then later on it might be more of a surprise, or this totally, I got very confused as I did not think that this was coming. Maybe, right, a little clue earlier could be helpful. So as you're providing your excellent feedback this week, do give a little bit of attention to how were you welcomed to your fellow writers, so that they can start to think about how they are engaging with their readers right away. So this week we are focusing on feedback for our prose pieces, and next week we'll start exploring poetry and checking out how we can use other tools like line breaks and extended metaphor to engage our readers as well. I cannot wait to see how you use the feedback you get this week to continue to work with your pieces as you develop them for your e-portfolio at the end of the term. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to get in touch. Take care and keep in touch.